The land office in Caldwell, Kansas smelled like sawdust and ink, and the particular desperation of people who had traveled too far on too little hope. Maria Donnelly stood at the clerk's narrow counter on a Tuesday morning in April of 1878, her hands pressed flat against the worn wood, staring at a document that made no sense to her, and then, quite suddenly, made every terrible kind of sense. "Say that again," she said, her voice low and controlled in the way that voices only get when the speaker is holding something enormous very carefully. "Say exactly what you just told me." The clerk, a thin man named Horace with ink-stained fingers and the disposition of someone who delivered bad news so frequently he had stopped feeling it, cleared his throat. "The parcel you have applied for, ma'am, Section 12, Township 33 South, Range 2 West, has a neighboring claim filed against it. Filed 3 days prior to yours, in fact. The eastern boundary of the neighboring claim runs directly adjacent to your western boundary. The water source, the spring creek that feeds across both parcels, has been listed in the neighboring claim as a shared resource pending dispute." "Pending dispute," Maria repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "And who," she asked, "filed the neighboring claim?" Horace slid a second document across the counter. The name at the top, written in a bold, slanted hand, read Walter Ford. Maria had heard that name exactly once before, 2 weeks ago, when an old rancher outside of Wichita had told her to avoid the stretch of cattle country south of Caldwell because a man named Ford was buying up everything that wasn't nailed down. She had thought nothing of it then. She thought a great deal of it now. "Is he here?" she asked. Horace blinked. "Ma'am, Walter Ford, is he in Caldwell? I believe Mr. Ford arrived yesterday, actually. He's been expecting some difficulty with the water rights portion of his filing." "Difficulty," Maria said very quietly. "Yes, I imagine he has." She turned from the counter and walked straight out of the land office into the blinding Kansas morning, and she stood on the wooden boardwalk with the spring wind cutting through her gray traveling dress, and she made a decision. She was going to find Walter Ford. She was going to look him directly in the face. And she was going to make absolutely certain he understood that whatever game he thought he was playing with her land and her water and her future, he had miscalculated very badly indeed. She had come too far. She had lost too much. She had given up everything she had in the East, her late husband's debts, her sister's pity, her mother's worried letters, to start over on 160 acres of Kansas grass and promise. The Homestead Act had given her a legal right to that land. Walter Ford had filed his claim 3 days before hers, yes, but the water crossed both parcels, and Maria Donnelly had not survived the last 2 years of her life by letting men tell her what she could and could not have. She had arrived in Caldwell the previous evening by stagecoach from Wichita, exhausted and road-sore, carrying one trunk and a satchel and a folded map she had studied for so many hours that the creases had worn through the paper. The map showed the spring creek threading down from a low ridge and crossing diagonally through the section of land she had chosen deliberately, because a woman alone on the frontier needed water above every other thing. Without the creek, the land was grass and nothing else. With it, the land was a future. She had known, filing the claim, that the adjacent parcels were unoccupied. The land agent in Wichita had told her so. He had been wrong, apparently, or he had been lying, or Walter Ford had moved faster than anyone expected. And now here she was, standing outside a land office in Caldwell with her heart hammering and her jaw set, needing to understand which of those 3 possibilities was the truth. She found Walter Ford at the hotel on Main Street, which was the only hotel in Caldwell worth the name, a 2-story building called the Drover's Rest that catered primarily to cattlemen pushing herds up from Texas. He was coming down the front steps as she was climbing them, and they nearly collided on the second step from the bottom. Maria stopped. The man stopped. They looked at each other. He was taller than she had expected, which was an odd thing to think, since she had formed no particular expectation. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that the Kansas sun had taken a proprietary interest in, weathered at the corners of the eyes and along the jaw, but not unpleasant. He wore a cattleman's practical clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a dark blue shirt, worn boots. He carried his hat in one hand, which suggested he had just come from somewhere he'd been expected to be polite. "Mr. Ford," she said. He paused. "Ma'am." He looked at her with the alert, measuring expression of a man who had learned to assess the nature of an approaching problem very quickly. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," Maria said. "My name is Maria Donnelly. I have just come from the land office, where I was informed that you have filed a claim directly beside mine. I would like to discuss the water rights." Something moved across his face, not guilt, she thought, not precisely, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like recognition, and then something that looked like the decision not to be caught recognizing it. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said. He put his hat on. "I was wondering when you'd come." That stopped her for just a moment. "Were you? I saw your claim at the office yesterday," he said. "I knew there would be a conversation." "Did you file beside me deliberately?" she asked. She kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. It was a skill she had developed during 2 years of marriage to a man who owed money to the wrong people and preferred to let her manage the conversations. Walter Ford looked at her steadily. "The land I filed on is land I have been tracking for 2 years," he said. "I need the eastern grazing range for my cattle operation. My herd winters on the northern range and moves south in spring. The creek water is essential for the drive." "It is equally essential," Maria said, "for the homestead I intend to build. I know that." "Then you understand," she said, "why I am standing here." "I do," he said. He studied her for a moment. "I don't intend to take your water, Mrs. Donnelly. I never have. The pending dispute notation at the land office is procedural. It means the water rights haven't been formally allocated yet, not that I am claiming all of them." Maria looked at him for a long moment. She had become, over the last 2 years, a reasonably good judge of whether men were lying to her. Walter Ford did not have the specific quality of eye movement and jaw tension that she associated with active deception. But he had something else, a careful guardedness, a deliberate control over what he said and did not say that suggested there were things he was not volunteering. "I would like that in writing," she said. He blinked, and then something changed in his expression, a loosening almost, something like genuine surprise giving way to something that was nearly unexpectedly amusement. "All right," he said. "I suppose that's fair." "I think it is considerably more than fair," Maria said. "I think it is the minimum reasonable expectation." They looked at each other on the steps of the Drover's Rest, and the spring wind moved between them, and somewhere down the street a horse shook its head against a hitching post with a sound like a low bell. "Would you have breakfast with me, Mrs. Donnelly?" Walter Ford asked. Maria considered him. She was hungry. She had not eaten since the previous evening. And she had found in her experience that you learned more about a man's true intentions in an hour of breakfast conversation than in 3 months of formal correspondence. "Yes," she said, "but I am paying for my own meal." The particular quality of the quiet that followed told her she had surprised him. "Of course," he said after a moment. "This way." Maria Donnelly had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the second daughter of a hardware merchant who had strong opinions about land ownership and Abraham Lincoln and the importance of independent income. She had married Patrick Donnelly at 23, a man with charm enough for 3 people and financial sense enough for none of them. Patrick had died of typhoid fever in the winter of 1876, leaving Maria at 25 with the hardware merchant's practicality, a set of debts, and the stubborn conviction that she was not finished yet. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed any citizen, including widows, to file a claim on 160 acres of federal land, provided they lived on it and improved it for 5 years. Maria had spent 6 months studying the provision, reading everything she could find about the territories, writing letters to land agents in Kansas and Nebraska and Dakota. Kansas had won for one specific reason. The Kishom Trail had made the economy of southern Kansas vigorous and growing, which meant that a woman running a small cattle operation or a farm or even a boarding house had a realistic chance of building something sustainable. She had sold everything Patrick had left that wasn't claimed by debt. She had put the money in a bank account in her own name, which required a specific and exhausting conversation with the bank manager that she preferred not to think about, and she had booked passage west. She had not, in any of her careful planning, accounted for Walter Ford. The hotel dining room was quiet at this hour, just a few men with coffee and the tired expressions of people who had been on the trail too long. Maria and Walter Ford took a table by the window, and the woman who served them was broad-shouldered and efficient and addressed Maria as though she were an entirely unremarkable presence, which Maria appreciated. They ordered eggs and biscuits and coffee. Walter Ford wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her with the directness she was beginning to identify as characteristic of him. "How long have you been planning to come west?" he asked. 2 years, she said, "since my husband died." She watched him receive that information. There was no performed sympathy, which she liked. There was acknowledgement and then a slight adjustment in his attention as though he was recalibrating something. "I'm sorry," he said, simply, without the usual elaboration that required her to say something reassuring. "Thank you," she said in the same key. "And the land in Section 12, you chose it specifically." "I chose it for the water," she said, "and for the soil profile and for the access to the Caldwell market." She paused. "I have been very thorough." "I believe you," he said. He said it without condescension, which was notable. "What is your operation?" she asked. "How many head?" "Currently about 400, he said. "I'm building toward 800. I run longhorns up from Texas in the spring drive and hold them on the southern Kansas range through summer before selling in fall. The eastern section I filed on is the piece of range I've needed for 2 seasons to expand the holding capacity. Without it, I can't run the numbers I need to make the operation viable long-term." "And the creek," Maria said. "Without the creek," he said, "the eastern section can't sustain cattle through a dry summer." He looked at her directly. "And without the creek, your homestead can't produce enough to sustain you through the first year." "We both need it," she said. "We both need it," he agreed. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the street was beginning to come alive with the particular energy of a cattle town in spring boots on boardwalks, the distant sound of livestock, a wagon rolling past with a load of lumber. "I want to be honest with you," Walter Ford said. He set his coffee cup down. "The water rights dispute is not going to resolve itself in the next week. The land office will require documentation from both of us, proof of improvement, proof of habitation, evidence of beneficial use. That process takes months. In the meantime, both claims are valid and both of us have the right to use the creek." "I know that," Maria said. "I read the statutes." "I figured you had." He almost smiled. It changed his face in an interesting way. "What I'm saying is that the next several months are going to be easier if we're not fighting each other." "I agree," Maria said, "which is why I want the agreement in writing." "What specifically do you want it to say?" She had thought about this on the walk from the land office. "Equal access to the creek for domestic use, stock water and irrigation, measured by volume and not by priority. Neither party to obstruct the natural flow of the creek as it crosses both parcels. Any future formal allocation of water rights to be negotiated in good faith before either party applies for a court determination." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking through it, which was different from the men who simply waited for her to finish speaking and then said no. He was actually considering the terms. "The volume measurement," he said. "How do you propose to enforce that?" "A gauge post on the creek at the boundary line," she said, "checked weekly. And if there's a drought year and the volume drops below what we both need, then we negotiate in good faith," she said. "The same as the last clause." He looked at her with an expression that she could not quite name. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like the look of someone who had come to an interaction expecting one thing and found something considerably more complicated. "I'll agree to those terms," he said. "Good," Maria said. "I know a lawyer in Wichita who can draft it." "I know one in Caldwell who is cheaper and faster," he said. "Is he trustworthy?" "He is when he's sober," Walter Ford said. "Which is most mornings." Maria looked at him. He looked at her. And there it was again, that almost smile, that loosening of the careful control he kept over his expression, brief and contained, and somehow more revealing for being so obviously restrained. "This morning would be ideal, then," Maria said. The lawyer's name was Calhoun, and he was indeed sober at 10 in the morning, and he drafted the water rights agreement in a clean, formal hand that Maria read 3 times before she signed it. Walter Ford signed it without reading it again, which told her either that he trusted her or that he was very confident in his ability to manage whatever he signed, or possibly both. He paid Calhoun's fee before she could reach for her own money, and when she looked at him sharply he said, "I proposed him. It's courtesy." She let it go. She was choosing her battles. They walked out of Calhoun's office into the bright Kansas morning with a signed agreement and no particular reason to continue in each other's company. And there was a moment of uncertainty that Maria found oddly uncomfortable, the kind of uncertainty that comes not from disliking someone, but from liking them more than you expected and not knowing what to do about it. "I'll be riding out to the section this afternoon," Walter Ford said, "to assess the pasture condition before I bring the herd up. If you wanted to see the land together, to walk the boundary line, I could show you where the creek crosses." She should have said no. She had her own horse, a rented brown mare from the Caldwell livery, and she was perfectly capable of finding the creek on her own. But there was practical value in walking the boundary with the man who had filed beside her. There was practical value in understanding exactly what he was building and where, and how it would affect her own plans. "Yes," she said, "that would be useful." They rode south from Caldwell in the early afternoon, the prairie opening around them like something released from confinement. Maria had seen photographs of the Kansas grassland, but photographs had not prepared her for the physical reality of it, the vast, rolling sweep of it, the way the grass moved in the wind with a sound like the ocean she had grown up too far inland to know. The sky was enormous. It pressed down at the edges and opened up overhead in a blue so deep it seemed to have weight. She rode beside Walter Ford and they were mostly quiet, which was comfortable in a way she had not anticipated. He pointed out landmarks, a line of cottonwoods that marked the creek's course from a mile away, a low ridge to the east that would provide natural wind protection for a winter camp, the faint tire marks of previous survey wagons where the section line had been measured. "There," he said, when they came over a shallow rise. The creek was modest, not a river, not even what you would call a stream in a wetter part of the country. But it ran clear and cold from the ridge above, threading through the grass in a gentle curve, and the cottonwoods along its banks were beginning to leaf out in the particular new green of April. On either side of the creek, the land was exactly as the map had described it, gently rolling, well-drained, with the dark soil that indicated good grass-growing capacity. Maria stopped her horse at the top of the rise and looked at it for a long moment. It was everything she had planned for. It was better, actually, than the descriptions had led her to expect. The creek bank had a natural flattening on the western side, her side that would be ideal for a kitchen garden. The rise to the north would shelter a house from the worst winter winds. The grass was thick and varied, the kind of grass that supported both cattle and horses. "What do you think?" Walter Ford asked. He was watching her, not the land. "I think," Maria said slowly, "that it is exactly right." They rode down to the creek and watered the horses. Maria dismounted and crouched at the water's edge, testing the temperature with her fingers. Cold and clear, faintly mineral, good drinking water. She stood and turned to find Walter Ford standing a few feet away, his horse's reins loose in his hand, looking not at her but at the eastern pasture spread beyond the creek. "The herd comes up from Texas in 6 weeks," he said. "I'll have 12 men with me for the drive and then a skeleton crew for the summer holding. I'll need to set up a camp on the eastern section before then." "Will the camp be near the boundary line?" Maria asked. "About a quarter-mile east," he said. "Far enough that it won't be an issue." She nodded. She was looking at the same eastern pasture now and trying to see it through his eyes, the sweep of grazing land, the capacity for cattle. She understood cattle operations in the abstract. Her father had sold hardware to ranchers as well as farmers, and she had grown up listening to the economics of it at the dinner table. The numbers Walter Ford was describing were serious. 400 head of longhorns was not a small operation. 800 was the beginning of something significant. "May I ask you something directly?" she said. He glanced at her. "You've been doing that all morning." "Your claim beside mine," she said. "I need to know with certainty that it was not strategic, that you did not file adjacent to a widow's homestead claim specifically because you expected to be able to acquire the water rights through attrition." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Walter Ford turned to face her fully. He took a breath, and she watched him making a decision about what to say, and then he said something she had not expected. "I will tell you the truth," he said. "When I first looked at the sections available, I identified the Spring Creek as the critical factor, and I looked at every parcel that touched it. Yours was one of them. I knew when I saw your claim had been filed that there would be a complication. I told myself the water rights would work out through legal process. I did not tell myself that the widow who had filed the claim would simply give up and go away." He held her gaze when he said it. He did not look away. "I believe you," she said. She was surprised to find that she did. "But I want you to understand that I am not going to give up and go away." "I know," he said. "I knew it this morning on the hotel steps." "How?" "Because you looked at me," he said, "the way people look when they are not afraid of what they see." Maria was quiet for a moment. The creek moved past them with its small, persistent sound. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. It was not an intrusive question. It was the question of someone who was genuinely paying attention. "Typhoid," she said. "In the winter of '76. He was 31. "I'm sorry," he said again. "He was not a practical man," Maria said. "He was kind and funny and completely unable to manage money. I loved him very much, and I spent most of our marriage compensating for his financial decisions." She paused. "After he died, I had to choose between going back to my parents' house and making a life of my own. I chose this." She made a small gesture at the prairie around them. "That takes courage," Walter Ford said. He said it plainly, without the particular brand of patronizing encouragement that men sometimes offered women who did things they considered unexpectedly competent. "It takes stubbornness," Maria said, "which I have in quantity." "I've noticed," he said. And this time he actually smiled, a real smile with some warmth in it, and it was a better smile than she had expected from a face that mostly held itself so carefully in reserve. They rode back to Caldwell in the long light of the Kansas afternoon, talking about practical things: the local lumber suppliers, the quality of the Caldwell market prices, the specific challenges of the 1877 grasshopper infestation that had destroyed crops across southern Kansas, and the likelihood of it recurring. Walter Ford knew the country well. He had been working this part of Kansas for 3 years, and he knew the names of the other ranchers and the names of the feed store proprietors and the particular reputation of the land office clerk Horace, who was apparently honest but slow. He knew things that would take her years to learn, and she was not too proud to listen. In return, she found herself sharing what she knew: the supply routes from the east, the pricing differences between Kansas City and Chicago markets, the legal framework around water rights that she had studied so carefully in Cincinnati. He listened with the same focused attention he seemed to bring to everything, asking specific questions rather than the vague, affirmative sounds that men sometimes made when they were waiting for a woman to stop talking. By the time Caldwell came back into view, she had a peculiar feeling she was unable to immediately identify. It took her until she had returned the mare to the livery and was walking back to her hotel to understand what it was. She had not in a long time been in the company of someone she was genuinely glad to have met. The following week was one of the most productively exhausting of Maria Donnelly's life. She finalized her homestead filing at the land office. She arranged for lumber delivery from a mill in Wichita. She hired a local carpenter named Elias Price to begin construction on the claim, a small house first, because the law required it, and then the outbuildings. She purchased seed from the Caldwell Agricultural Supply, made arrangements with a farmer 8 miles north who would sell her 2 milk cows and a breeding pair of hogs in May, and began the paperwork to acquire 6 breeding ewes from a wool operation near Wellington. She was at the land section every day by 7 in the morning, supervising the construction, pacing out the kitchen garden, measuring the creek's flow, and recording it in a small notebook. The gauge post was installed at the boundary line on the 3rd day. Walter Ford appeared at the boundary line on the 4th day, riding a gray horse she hadn't seen before, and he looked at the gauge post and then at her and said, "Good." "Just that. The reading today is 42 gallons per minute," she told him. "I'll record it every Tuesday. I'll send one of my men to cross-check," he said. "That's fair," she said. He looked at the frame of the house going up 50 yards behind her. "Price's work," he said. "He's good." "He is," she said, "though he drinks too much coffee and talks about his sister-in-law constantly." "That's accurate," Walter Ford said. She looked at him. He was looking at the house frame with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not disapproval, not admiration, something more complicated than either. "You thought I wouldn't actually build it," she said. He met her eyes. "I thought there was a reasonable chance you would assess the situation and decide the land was too remote for a single woman to manage. And now, he said, "I think you would probably assess any situation and find a way to manage it." She felt warmth that she firmly declined to acknowledge. "The house will be framed by the end of the week," she said. "I'll be in residence by the 1st of May." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "I'll be moving the camp onto the eastern section in 3 weeks. If you need anything before then, any difficulty with the construction, any trouble with supplies, send word to the Drovers' Rest. I'll be there until the camp is established." Maria looked at him steadily. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He tipped his hat, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as genuine rather than performative, and turned his horse and rode east toward his section. She watched him go for a moment before going back to the house frame, and she was absolutely certain she did not watch him longer than was necessary. The house was finished enough to sleep in by May 3rd, and Maria moved in on May 4th with her trunk and her satchel, and a rocking chair she had bought from a woman in Caldwell who was moving back east. She slept that first night with the prairie wind against the new boards of the walls and the sound of the creek somewhere in the dark beyond the window opening, and she felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that approached peace. The first real conversation they had that was not about land or water or legal documents happened on a Saturday evening in late May, when Maria had ridden to Caldwell for her weekly supply run and encountered Walter Ford at the general store, doing the same. They loaded their purchases simultaneously, working around each other in the comfortable, unconscious way of people who have been in proximity long enough to develop an instinctive sense of each other's movement. "Stay for supper," he said. "The hotel has a decent cook on Saturday evenings." She ought to have declined. She had supplies to get home before dark and work to do in the morning. She had also been talking to no one but Elias Price and the 2 men she'd hired to help with the spring planting for 3 weeks, and she was more hungry for adult conversation than she was willing to admit. "All right," she said. The hotel dining room was more lively than it had been in April, full of drovers and cattle buyers and the varied population of a trail town in full spring swing. Walter Ford got them a table in the corner, away from the worst of the noise, and ordered steak and potatoes, and a bottle of decent wine that Maria suspected was significantly better than the hotel usually stocked. They talked for 2.5 hours, not about land or water or legal documents, about everything else. He had grown up in Missouri. She learned a farming family, 4 brothers, his mother dead when he was 9. He had come west at 18, worked cattle drives for 5 years, before starting his own operation on borrowed money and relentless labor. He had been building the Ford cattle operation for 8 years, piece by piece, with the specific and focused intention of a man who had decided exactly what he wanted and was unwilling to accept the alternatives. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's hardware store, about her sister Catherine, who had married a lawyer and lived in Cleveland and wrote letters of gentle concern, about the particular quality of Ohio winters that made Kansas winters seem, in comparison, almost sympathetic. She told him about Patrick. Not the debts this time, but the person, the way he laughed, the terrible jokes, the genuine kindness that had made her love him even when she was furious with him. Patrick had been real and specific and gone, and she did not speak of him with grief exactly, but with the complex clarity of someone who had finished grieving and arrived at something more honest. Walter Ford listened to all of it. He was very good at listening, not the polite, waiting kind of listening, but the real kind, where you could tell a person was actually receiving what you said rather than preparing their response. "You've been alone a long time," he said, when she had gone quiet. "Been capable for a long time," she said. "Those are different things." "They are," he said. They looked at each other across the table, and it was a different kind of looking than any of the previous ones, less assessment, less wariness, more simply seeing. "I want to tell you something," he said. He was turning his wine glass in one hand, a habitual gesture she had noticed. "When I rode out to look at the section for the first time 3 years ago, I imagined a cattle operation, just the operation. I have never, until recently, imagined anything else on that land." She waited. "That is changing," he said. He said it carefully, with the same deliberate control he brought to everything, but she could hear something underneath it that the control was not quite managing. She was not a woman who pretended not to understand what people meant. "That is a significant thing to tell me," she said. "I know. We have known each other for 6 weeks," she said. "We had a formal dispute over water rights." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not proposing anything. I am being honest." He looked at her directly. "I thought you would prefer honesty." "I do prefer honesty," she said. "Then there it is," he said. "Honest." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the wine in her glass. The candlelight was warm. Outside, the Saturday night sounds of Caldwell boots on boardwalks. A piano from one of the saloons came through the walls in a muffled, distant way. "I have been alone for 2 years," she said finally. "I came west to build something, to be competent and independent and not require anything of anyone. Those are still my goals." "I wouldn't ask you to change them," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the thing I am struggling with." The honesty of it surprised her as she said it. She had not intended to say it. But it was true, and he had set the standard for truth-telling, and she found she was unwilling to be less brave than he was. He looked at her with those careful, steady eyes, and something in him went very still, not the stillness of holding back, the stillness of receiving something important very carefully. "We could take the time," he said. "There is no rush in what I said." "No," she agreed. "There is no rush." They rode back to their respective properties under a sky so thick with stars it seemed structural, as though the stars were holding something up rather than simply burning in a dark expanse. They rode to the property boundary and paused there, by the gauge post on the creek, and the water moved past them in the dark with its small, constant voice. "Good night, Maria," he said. He used her first name for the first time, and it was not an accident. "Good night, Walter," she said. Also not an accident. The summer came in hard and golden and full of work. Maria's kitchen garden produced beyond her most optimistic projections, the creek providing steady water even through the dry stretch in July when the grass on the upland turned brittle and the sky stayed white for weeks. She had 12 rows of corn and a substantial potato yield and squash and beans, and she spent evenings putting things up in jars and felt a satisfaction that was physical and deep. The Ford cattle operation moved onto the eastern section in late May, and the sounds of it became part of her landscape. The low sound of the herd in the evenings, the occasional shout of a drover, the smell of cook-fire smoke drifting west on the evening wind. She found she did not mind these things. They were the sounds of someone else's purposeful life running parallel to her own, close enough to be companionable without being intrusive. Walter Ford came to the boundary line regularly, sometimes with purpose, to check the gauge post, to discuss a question about the creek's course after a heavy rain in June, and sometimes with no particular stated reason, which she understood to mean the same thing as her own occasional rides to the eastern section line in the late afternoon. They had found a rhythm that was neither one thing nor another, neither simple neighboring nor courtship in any formal sense, but something honest and growing in the space between those definitions. He helped her in July when a section of fence on her north pasture went down in a thunderstorm, and the 2 young heifers she'd acquired in June wandered into the open country north of the creek. He brought 2 of his riders and they spent half a day recovering the cattle, and when it was done, he stayed for the coffee she offered, and they sat on the porch of the small house she was already thinking of as entirely hers, and watched the evening come in across the prairie. "You've been here 3 months," he said. "I have." She cradled her coffee. "It feels longer. Is that good or bad?" "It is simply true," she said. "In a good way, I think. I have not felt this settled in a very long time." It was quiet for a moment. Then, "The herd goes north to the railroad at Abilene in September. I'll be gone 3 weeks for the drive." She had not thought about him being gone. The realization that she had not thought about it and the further realization of what it meant that she noticed his absence now, in advance, was interesting information. "The ranch camp stays," he said. "2 of my men will overwinter on the eastern section, but I'll be away for September." "I know how cattle drives work," she said. "I know you do." A pause. "I suppose I'm telling you because," he stopped. "Because," she prompted. "Because I want you to know I'm coming back," he said. He said it simply, with the straightforwardness she had come to expect from him and still found quietly remarkable. She looked at him in the evening light, this careful, deliberate, unexpectedly kind man who had filed a claim beside hers and then shown up on hotel steps ready for the difficult conversation, who had signed the water agreement without flinching, who listened when she spoke. "I know you're coming back," she said. He looked at her, and she held the look, and he reached over and covered her hand with his just his large, work-roughened hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and she turned her hand over and his fingers closed gently around hers, and they sat that way for a while as the prairie darkened and the first stars came out. It was the most intimate thing Maria had experienced in 2 years. It was enough. The summer moved through its weeks with a generosity that felt almost personal. The creek held its flow, both properties prospered, and the boundary line between Walter Ford's eastern section and Maria Donnelly's claim became, over time, the most frequently traveled piece of ground on either parcel. She came to know his men by name, Pete and Raphael, and the young one from Alabama named Thomas, who had come west looking for something he couldn't quite articulate but seemed to be finding in the cattle work. She came to know the gray horse he rode, whose name was apparently just Gray, because Walter Ford did not believe in elaborate names for horses. He came to know her garden's yield, knew when the corn was ready and when the squash was past its peak, and could distinguish between the good days when everything was working and the hard days when she had pushed herself past tired into something grimmer and needed, not help exactly, but company. In early August, a man from a large ranch operation 40 miles south appeared at Maria's door on a Tuesday morning when Walter was away at a cattle buyers' meeting in Caldwell. The man's name was Hadley Greer, and he represented an operation called the Box C, and he was polite in a particular way that Maria recognized immediately as the politeness of someone who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. He offered to buy her claim. The price he named was fair by most measures, a reasonable return on the money she'd invested. He made the offer standing on her porch with his hat in his hand and the easy confidence of a man who was accustomed to getting what he went after. Maria asked him to sit. She poured him coffee. She asked him to explain the Box C's interest in her specific parcel, and he explained, smoothly and plausibly, that the Box C was expanding its Kansas operations, and the Section 12 parcel was ideally situated for their needs. She asked him whether the Box C had spoken to Walter Ford about his adjacent claim. There was a brief pause. "Mr. Ford's operation is separate," Hadley Greer said. "Is the Box C's interest in my parcel related to the Spring Creek?" she asked. Another pause, slightly longer. "That is one factor among several," he said. "Then you want the water access," Maria said. "And the way to get it is to acquire my claim, which holds the western bank, since Mr. Ford's claim is more established and more expensive." Hadley Greer looked at her with a new expression, not hostile but the specific look of someone who had expected a shorter conversation. "Mrs. Donnelly," he began. "I am not selling," she said. She kept her voice pleasant. "I came here to build a home, and I am building one. No offer will change that, but I am obliged to you for the coffee and the visit." He left with more grace than she had expected, which she credited to his professionalism, if not his motives. She rode to the cattle camp that afternoon and told Walter about the visit when he returned from Caldwell. His expression went through several things in quick succession: alarm, then a hard kind of anger, then something that settled into a careful steadiness. "The Box C," he said. "I know them. They have been expanding aggressively south of Wichita. They bought out 2 smaller operations last year." He looked at her. "They'll come back." "I know," she said. "They may apply pressure to the water rights question," he said. "If they can generate a dispute about the creek allocation, they can use it to argue that neither claim is fully viable and push both of us to sell." "I am aware of that possibility," Maria said, "which is why our water agreement is already in writing." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had learned, the one that meant he was adjusting his assessment of her upward and not quite sure what to do about how much he liked what he found. "You thought of this already," he said. "I thought of a version of it," she said. "Not specifically the Box C, but a large operation wanting the water access. It was always a realistic risk." "What do you want to do?" he asked. It was the right question, not "what should we do," which would have implied a management he had not been given, but "what do you want to do," which respected that it was her land and her decision first. "I want to make sure my claim is as solid as possible," she said. "I want to accelerate the improvements, add another outbuilding, put the kitchen garden on formal record as evidence of agricultural use. And I want to talk to Calhoun about whether there is any way to formalize the water agreement further, to register it with the land office as an easement." "I'll have my lawyer from Wichita look at the easement question," Walter said. "Between the two of us, we should have enough documentation to make a buyout attempt look very unattractive to a judge." "Good," Maria said. They stood in the early evening light of the cattle camp, the herd moving quietly in the background, the creek audible from 50 yards away, and the particular quality of the light in August thick and amber, and still lay across everything like something that had decided to stay. Walter reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face where the wind had pulled it loose, a gesture so natural and unhurried that it registered in her chest like a tuning fork struck against something solid. "You're not frightened," he said, soft, almost wondering. "I am a little frightened," she said. "I'm also not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned in and kissed her, gently and with complete intention, and she kissed him back in the same way, and the amber light held steady around them, and the creek kept running past, and the herd moved in its slow bovine patterns behind them as if nothing had changed and everything had. They stayed like that for a while, not urgently, just close, his forehead against hers in the cooling evening air. "I should get back," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. He did not move for another moment. "Maria." "Yes, I am not a complicated man in most ways," he said, "but there is one thing I want you to know." He pulled back just enough to see her face. "I am not interested in half of anything. If this goes where I think it is going, I am in it entirely." The directness of it was startling, and then, when she had absorbed it, not startling at all. It was exactly how he was. She had known that since the hotel steps. "I know," she said. "I am the same way." She paused. "Give me time, Walter. Not because I am uncertain about you, because I have learned to be careful with myself. All the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere either. He walked her to her horse, and she rode west in the August evening, and the grassland spread around her in that last golden light, and she was aware of being happy in a way that she had not been in a long time, and was not yet entirely certain how to trust. September came, and Walter Ford took the herd north to Abilene. He was gone 3 weeks and 2 days, which Maria counted without fully acknowledging that she was counting. During that time, a representative from the Boxsea appeared twice more on her property, once in person, once in the form of a written offer delivered by a writer. She declined both without drama. She was not entirely alone. Walter had left 2 men on the eastern section, an older hand named Curtis and the young one from Alabama, Thomas, with instructions to be available if Mrs. Donnelly needed anything. She did not need anything, but she appreciated that they were there, and she occasionally brought them things from her garden because feeding people was one of the ways she processed feeling. When Walter returned in late September, lean and trail-tired and sun-darkened to an almost startling degree, he came directly to the boundary line rather than to his camp, and he dismounted and looked at her as she came to meet him, and she thought, looking at him, that she had missed him in a way that was specific and particular, and not at all abstract. She held out her hand, and he took it and held it for a moment, and then pulled her gently into his arms, and she went without hesitation, feeling the trail dust and the warmth of him, and thinking that the word relief was not large enough for what it was, but it was in the general vicinity. "You're back," she said, her face against his shoulder. "I'm back," he said. The fall settled around them with its particular richness, the grass going gold and copper, the nights sharpening, the creek running clean and cold in the morning. The Boxsea made one final approach in October, this time sending a lawyer rather than a representative, with a formal offer to purchase both the Donnelly claim and the Ford Eastern section as a single transaction. Maria and Walter sat together at her kitchen table. She had a real table now and 4 chairs, and a cast-iron stove that she was profoundly proud of, and read the offer letter together. It was substantially higher than the original offer. It was also completely irrelevant. "No," Maria said. "No," Walter agreed. They wrote a joint response, which Calhoun sent to the Boxea's lawyer in Wichita, and the Boxea was not heard from again. Whether they had decided both claims were too well documented to challenge, or whether the joint response had made clear that the 2 operations were effectively acting in concert, and therefore represented a significantly larger obstacle than 2 individual claims, Maria was not certain. She did not particularly care. November arrived, and with it the first real cold, the prairie going pale and the creek narrowing slightly in the early frosts. Maria was well prepared. She had stocked her larder with everything she'd preserved through the summer, had enough grain and hay for the animals through a hard winter, and had winterized the house with additional insulation, and a second stove that she had acquired from a settler who was abandoning his claim 50 miles east and selling everything before heading back to Missouri. She had also been thinking about Walter Ford with a clarity and steadiness that she was beginning to understand was simply going to be permanent. She invited him for Thanksgiving dinner. She spent 2 days cooking, a goose that she had bartered from a neighbor 6 miles north, sweet potatoes, cornbread, preserved green beans, 2 pies. When he arrived at her door on the last Thursday of November, he had a bottle of bourbon from the Caldwell General Store and an expression of anticipatory pleasure that she found entirely endearing. They ate at her kitchen table by lamplight, and it was warm and close and good, and the conversation moved easily between the practical. What the winter looked like, plans for the spring, the question of whether she would expand her garden acreage or put some of the additional land into a small grain plot, and the personal, which was where they had been learning to go more readily. She told him about Thanksgiving in Cincinnati, her mother's cooking, the particular chaos of a family dinner with her father and two sisters, and all their various strong opinions. She told him about the last Thanksgiving before Patrick died, when he had burned the turkey and they had eaten ham instead and laughed about it. He told her about Thanksgiving on cattle drives, which were generally indistinguishable from other days, except for an attempt at some kind of celebratory meal that usually resulted in beans with bacon, and a group of men who were too tired to be properly festive. He told her about his brothers who were scattered across Missouri and Kansas, and one who had gone all the way to California. He told her that this was the first Thanksgiving he had spent in a house in 4 years. "Is that terrible?" she asked. "It was fine," he said. "This is better." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and thought that she was ready. The thought arrived with a certainty that was quiet and steady rather than urgent, which felt right. She had learned to distrust urgency in herself. She trusted this quiet kind of certain. "Walter," she said. Yes, he was watching her. "I want to tell you something." "All right." She folded her hands on the table. "When I came to Caldwell in April, I came with a very specific plan. Build the house, establish the claim, prove up the land over 5 years, be independent and capable and not require anything of anyone." She paused. "That was the right plan. I still believe in it." "So do I," he said. "But plans change when information changes," she said, "and my information has changed considerably since April." He was very still on his side of the table, that listening stillness. "I came here to build a life," she said. "I find that I would like to build it with you if you still want that." He got up from his chair in one motion and came around the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her, and his eyes were doing something she had not seen before, something open and unguarded in a way that his careful face rarely permitted. "Maria," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been wanting to ask you to marry me since approximately June," he said. "I have been waiting because you asked me for time." She laughed, a genuine laugh that came up from somewhere surprised. "You could have said something." "You could have too," he said. "I just did," she pointed out. He laughed too, and it was a good laugh, warm and real, and he pulled her up from her chair and she went, and they stood in the warm kitchen while the wind moved outside and the stove crackled, and it was, Maria thought, exactly the right place and time and person. He kissed her with intention, and she kissed him back with all of hers, and neither of them was in a hurry, and it was entirely unlike urgency and entirely like certainty. They were married on the 15th of December, 1878, at the courthouse in Caldwell, with Calhoun as a witness and Curtis the old ranch hand as the other. Maria wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had brought from Cincinnati and had been saving for an occasion she had not been able to specify. Walter wore a clean shirt and his least worn boots, and looked at her when she walked toward him across the courthouse floor, with an expression that she intended to remember for the rest of her life. The ceremony was brief, and the weather was cold, and they rode back to her claim through the pale December light, and went inside out of the wind, and Walter Ford lit the stove and Maria Ford unpacked the wedding supper. She had prepared that morning, and they ate at the kitchen table, and talked and laughed, and were extravagantly happy in the quiet, specific way of people who have found their right place after a long time of looking. Winter on the claim was different from what she had imagined, harder in some ways, warmer in others. The cold was serious, and the work of keeping animals and structures maintained in the face of January on the Kansas prairie was constant and demanding. But there were also the long evenings, the lamplight and the warm kitchen, Walter reading agricultural reports, while she worked on the household accounts or wrote letters to Catherine in Cleveland, and the particular peace of being in the same room as someone you trusted completely. He moved between the cattle camp and her house. Their house now, legally, since they had registered the marriage at the land office, and the two claims were now listed under both their names, with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years rather than months. He still ran the cattle operation on the eastern section, but the division between his land and hers had become a functional rather than a meaningful boundary, the creek running between them as it always had, serving both. Catherine wrote from Cleveland with the elaborate warmth of a woman who had been very worried and was now very relieved. Maria wrote back with the clarity of someone who had never needed relief on her own behalf but was glad, for Catherine's sake, that there was good news to report. Her father wrote from Cincinnati with a brief, gruff letter that said he was glad she had found steady ground and a capable partner, and that the water agreement sounded sensible. This was, from him, essentially a standing ovation. February brought a hard stretch of weather, the kind that tested everything: the house, the animals, the people. 3 days of blizzard followed by a thaw that turned everything to mud, followed by a refreeze that was somehow worse than the blizzard. Walter and his men worked the cattle through it with the practiced, dogged efficiency of people who had done this before and knew how to do it. Maria managed the household and the smaller animals with equal pragmatism, keeping the larder running and the house warm and producing enormous quantities of food that she sent to the cattle camp in a covered wagon run by Thomas, who had stayed on through winter and was becoming, she thought, a permanent fixture of the operation. There was one evening in the middle of February when the storm was at its worst, and Walter came in from the late check with ice in his hair and exhaustion in every line of his face, and she pulled the ice from his hair with her fingers and pressed a hot cup of coffee into his hands, and he sat at the kitchen table and looked at her with a gratitude that was not about the coffee. "I have been doing this for 8 years," he said. "The cattle drive, the winter on the range, the spring drive again. Every year." "Yes," she said. "It did not occur to me until this year," he said, "how much I was getting through it rather than living it." She put her hand against his face, cold even through the warmth of the kitchen. "You're living it now," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am." Spring came back in March with the particular miracle of it, the grass turning green underneath the dead winter grass, the creek running full and busy with snowmelt, the cottonwoods leafing out in that sharp new green. The kitchen garden went in early because the soil on the western bank of the creek was warm and willing, and Maria planted it larger than the year before, adding 2 new beds and a section for medicinal herbs that she had been planning since autumn. She discovered in late March that she was pregnant, which she identified herself from the evidence, before confirming it with the doctor who made a circuit of the southern Kansas homesteads every 6 weeks. She told Walter on a Sunday afternoon while they were checking the fence line on the north pasture. She said it simply, without preamble, because she had found that he always responded better to straightforward information than to elaborate setups. He went very still in the way he did when something important was happening, and then he turned to look at her from his horse, and his face was doing that open, unguarded thing again, only larger and more complete than she had seen it before. "Maria," he said. "In October," she said. "That is my calculation." He dismounted in a single motion and was beside her horse and then beside her, his hands up to help her down, and she dismounted into his arms, and he held her with a care that was so specific and so complete that she had to take a breath against it. "A baby," he said. "Apparently," she said. "Yes." He laughed, and she felt it against her face where her head was against his chest. "A baby," he said again, as though he was learning the word. She leaned back to look at him. He looked like a man who had been given something he had not allowed himself to hope for. She thought about what he had told her, the 8 years of cattle drives and winter range and doing things alone, and she understood something about what this meant to him. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said. He said it without qualification or embellishment, in the same plain way he said everything true. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. She thought about Cincinnati, about the hardware store, about Patrick and the debts and the long cold winter of widowhood, about the careful planning and the stagecoach and the land office and the water rights document and the hotel steps. She thought about everything that had been required to arrive at this moment on a North Kansas fence line in the March sun, with this specific man's arms around her. "Yes," she said again. I very much am. The spring was full of activity, the cattle operation moving into its seasonal rhythm, with the sounds and smells of it woven now into Maria's daily life as naturally as the creek's voice. Walter hired 2 additional men for the spring drive, bringing the crew to 9, and the eastern section became a busy and purposeful landscape of cattle and riders and equipment. Maria's kitchen garden produced with a generosity that she attributed partly to the soil and partly to the creek water, and partly to the satisfaction of working toward something concrete. She expanded the egg operation, adding 6 more laying hens to the 4 she'd had through winter, and she put up preserves with a focus that satisfied something deep and practical in her. The house grew around them. Walter and 2 of the hands built a second room onto the back in May, a bedroom with a window looking east toward the creek, planning ahead for October. They had long evenings on the porch, Maria with her growing belly and her mending or her letters, Walter with his cattle ledgers and the careful mathematics of the operation. The creek ran in the near distance, and the prairie moved in the evening wind, and sometimes Thomas would walk over from the camp with some question or news and stay for coffee. And these evenings felt to Maria like the specific weight of a life that was building itself correctly. In June, a letter came from the land office in Wichita confirming that the water rights easement on the Spring Creek had been formally registered as a shared-use easement in perpetuity between the Donnelly claim and the Ford Eastern section, now listed jointly as the Ford Donnelly property. The Box C challenge, had it ever been formally filed, would have faced a very solid wall of documentation. Maria read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then took it out to where Walter was doing fence inventory and handed it to him. He read it and handed it back and said, "Good." "That is all," she said. "Good. It's very good," he said. "We built something solid," she smiled. "Yes," she said. "We did." The summer was warm and productive, and the kind of content that she was learning to simply receive rather than analyze. She was not a person who had ever been easy with contentment. She had grown up with a father who treated any pausing as potential failure, and she had learned his particular vigilance along with his practical sense. But this summer, she was finding it possible to sit on the porch in the August evening heat with Walter beside her and simply be in the fact of it. He told her more about his past that summer, in the long, unhurried conversations of people who are becoming fully known to each other. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man in the way that hard country makes hard men, not unkind but armored. He told her about the first cattle drive he had gone on at 18, sick with excitement and practically incompetent, and how the older drovers had been alternately patient and merciless with him in exactly the proportion he had needed. He told her about the years of building the operation, the years of sleeping under sky rather than roof, and how it had shaped him into someone who knew exactly what he could endure. She understood, hearing it, where his carefulness came from not coldness but the caution of someone who had learned to hold things lightly in case they were lost. She understood it because she had developed her own version of the same caution. They were, she thought, well matched in this specific way, both of them practiced at managing alone, both of them unexpectedly willing to put that practice down. September brought the fall drive north, and this time Maria managed the waiting with more equanimity, partly because she was 30 weeks pregnant and managing anything took most of her available energy. Walter left Curtis and Thomas both on the section. He was not going to leave her without help that near to October, and he came back in 3 weeks and 2 days again, and this time when she came out to meet him on the porch, she was visibly and substantially pregnant, and he came off his horse almost before it had fully stopped and walked up to her with his hands out and a look on his face that she felt in her sternum. "You look," he started. "Do not say beautiful if you cannot say it without laughing," she warned. "Beautiful," he said without laughing. "You look completely beautiful." She put his hand on the side of her belly where the baby was moving, as the baby tended to do in the evenings, a habit she found both remarkable and occasionally exhausting. Walter went very still. That's, he said. Yes, she said. He stood there in the September evening with his hand against her and a look on his face that had no careful control in it at all. The baby came on the 4th of October, 1879, in the morning, with the doctor in attendance and Thomas dispatched on a fast horse to get him 3 days before the birth actually arrived. It was not an easy labor. It was 12 hours and hard going, but Maria Donnelly Ford was too stubborn to describe it as anything worse than difficult. And when it was done, and the doctor placed a baby boy in her arms, she looked at him with a complete astonishment that she had not anticipated. She had expected to love the baby. She had not anticipated the specific, physical, total nature of it. Walter was there in the room because she had said he was going to be there or the doctor could leave, and the doctor had been sensible enough to accept this. And when the baby was placed in Walter's arms, his face did that fully open thing, and he looked at Maria over the baby's head with something that was entirely beyond words, but was the best thing she had seen anyone's face do. Henry, she said. She had decided on the name in August from her mother's family. Henry, he said, trying it out, looking at the small face. Henry Ford. It sounded like a beginning, like the first line of something that would take a long time to tell. Henry Ford was a good baby by any objective measure, which Maria appreciated since she had been told she was a difficult baby and had assumed genetics might be unkind. He slept in the intervals one hoped for, ate with enthusiasm, and regarded the world from his cradle with the alert, assessing expression that Walter Ford apparently applied to all situations at any age, which Maria found almost comically accurate. Walter was, it turned out, someone who took to fatherhood with the same focused intentionality he brought to everything he cared about. He was up in the night when she was up, practical and without complaint about the disruption. He held the baby with the ease of a man who had helped birth cattle for 8 years, and had therefore developed a calm relationship with small living things that required handling. He talked to Henry in the serious, informative way he talked to everyone, explaining the operation of the stove, the purpose of the cattle ledger, the specific mechanism of the front door latch, and Maria would listen from across the room and feel something enormous moving through her chest. The fall of 1879 passed into winter and winter into spring, and the life they had built continued to build itself. The Ford Donnelly operation, as they had come informally to call it, was recognized in the southern Caldwell ranching community as one of the more effectively organized small operations in the county. The combination of the cattle enterprise on the eastern section and the agricultural productivity of the western homestead, creating a self-sustaining economy that many of the purely cattle-based operations around them could not match. Thomas had become effectively permanent, hired on at a fair wage with accommodation in the camp that Walter had improved significantly since the first season. Curtis had retired south to his sister's place in Texas, but sent word every few months. Walter hired 2 more men in the spring of 1880 as the herd expanded toward the 800 head he had originally planned. Maria's garden expanded again in the spring of 1880 to a full quarter-acre kitchen garden plus a 1-acre grain plot that she was farming experimentally, testing the soil's capacity. The creek ran steady and reliable as it always had, the gauge post faithfully recording its flow every Tuesday, the shared-use easement registered and solid in the Wichita Land Office. The water agreement that she had demanded the morning after meeting Walter Ford, that specific, documented, reasonable set of terms that she had negotiated from a position of complete determination and zero willingness to be managed, had held through 2 seasons without a single dispute. The creek served both operations without friction. The gauge post had never been needed as evidence in any formal proceeding. She sometimes thought about that morning. The land office and Horace and the document with Walter Ford's name on it in that bold, slanted hand. The fury of it, and the determination, and the hotel steps, And the careful man who had said I was wondering when you'd come. She thought about how close she had come to being undone by that moment. How easy it would have been to let it become only an adversarial thing, water rights and lawyers and competing claims. How the outcome might have been two people wearing each other down over years of legal fighting, while the creek ran past both their properties, serving neither of them adequately. Instead, here was Henry on a blanket on the kitchen floor in the spring of 1880, attempting to pull himself upright against the leg of the table, with the look of focused effort that was becoming his characteristic expression. Here was the garden outside the window turning green in the April morning. Here was Walter's voice from the back pasture, where he was directing one of the new hands in something, the specific carrying quality of it across the spring air. Here was the creek, audible on quiet mornings, threading its way between the cottonwoods. In May of 1880, she and Walter rode out together to the boundary line on a Sunday afternoon, Henry in a front carrier that Walter had rigged from canvas and leather, and that Henry accepted with his usual equanimity. They stood at the gauge post in the afternoon light, and Maria looked east across the cattle range and west across the garden land and felt the full measure of what had been built. 2 years, she said. 2 years, Walter agreed. From the hotel steps, she said. You were terrifying on those steps, he said. She laughed. I was furious on those steps. I know. He was smiling. It was the most impressive thing I had seen in years. Henry reached out from the carrier and grabbed a fistful of Walter's shirt with the decisive grip that was also apparently a genetic inheritance. Walter looked down at him with a patient affection that had not diminished in the 6 months since Henry had arrived, and showed no signs of doing so. More of this, Walter said. He meant all of it: the land, the operation, the child, the standing together at the boundary line in the afternoon sun. Yes, Maria said. More of this. They stood together at the place where their claims met, where the creek crossed from his land to hers and back again, where the gauge post had marked the shared flow through every season, and the Kansas spring moved around them in the grass and the cottonwood light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that either of them had come here to find, arrived at from opposite directions, and met at the exact place where the water ran between. Henry made a sound of either approval or digestion. It was sometimes difficult to distinguish, and Walter shifted him gently and offered Maria his free hand, and she took it without looking, the way you take the hand of someone who has become simply part of the geography of your life. The creek ran on. The grass moved in the spring wind. The claim was good. The claim was home. In the summer of 1881, when Henry was beginning to walk with the lurching confidence of a child who has decided that caution is for other people, Maria discovered she was pregnant again, and told Walter on the porch on a Wednesday evening in June with the same directness she had applied the first time. He received it the same way, that complete, open pleasure, and said, I hope it's a girl. You will love whoever it is, she said. Entirely, he agreed. But I hope it's a girl. The baby arrived in February of 1882, in the middle of a Kansas winter that was cold but not cruel, and she was indeed a girl, small and vocal and brown-eyed like her father, and with an expression of particular opinion that was apparently going to be her mother's specific contribution. They named her Alina, and Henry regarded her from a careful distance for approximately 2 days before deciding she was acceptable, and thereafter became her most assiduous guardian, which was going to be an interesting arrangement as she became capable of her own opinions. Walter held Alina in the lamplight of the bedroom on the night she was born, and looked at Maria with everything he had, and Maria looked back, and between them was the whole specific record of what they had built, the claims and the creek and the contract and the house, and Henry asleep in the next room, and Alina new in the world, and the spring coming in a few weeks and all the springs after that, stretching forward in the good particular way of things that are going to keep going. Do you know what I think about sometimes? Maria said. Tell me, he said. That first morning, she said, at the land office, when Horace slid that paper across the counter with your name on it. She paused. I was so angry. I know, he said. And also, she said, on some level I did not examine for a very long time, very interested. He raised an eyebrow. You had filed beside me, she said. The land office was bureaucratic and complicated, and the water rights were a genuine problem, and you were a potential obstacle. A pause. And you had also made a very specific and thoughtful choice about the land you wanted, for reasons that were sound and carefully considered, and that was interesting to me, even then. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those steady eyes. When I saw your claim at the office, he said, I thought someone else wants the creek. Someone who came a long way for this land and planned carefully. He shifted a leaner gently. I thought whoever you were not going to be easy about it. I wasn't, she said. No, he agreed. You were not. He looked at her in the lamplight. You were exactly right. The winter settled around the house, and the cattle camp and the kitchen garden put to rest under its thin cover of snow. And the creek ran under its ice in the patient way of things that have a long time ahead of them. And the Ford Donnelly claim held its ground against the Kansas cold, with the solidity of something that has been built with real intention by people who know what they are building toward. In the spring, the ice would break and the creek would run clear and cold again, and the gauge post would record its faithful measure, and the garden would go in, and the herd would move on the eastern section, and Henry would try to explain things to Alina in his serious, informative way, and Alina would have opinions about all of it. Walter would ride the fence lines and Maria would write in her account books, and they would eat together at the kitchen table and sit on the porch in the evenings, and watch the prairie go through its seasons with the particular pleasure of people who belong to a place. They had come from different directions, Walter Ford and Maria Donnelly, to the same creek on the same Kansas prairie, and they had argued over water and signed agreements and walked boundary lines and built a house and a family and a partnership that was worth every complicated thing it had cost to get there. The land was good. The water ran clear. The claim was proved and home was made, and the years ahead were long and full and theirs, and the spring creek ran between their two sections of ground like a seam that held everything together, as it always had, as it would keep doing for as long as they worked the land and called it theirs. Maria Donnelly Ford had come to file a claim. She had found the neighboring cattleman had filed one right beside hers, and out of that collision of water rights and stubbornness and early morning honesty on a set of hotel steps, she had built the truest and most complete thing she had ever made. The creek was still running in the morning when she woke, and the stove still needed lighting, and Alina was beginning to make the specific sounds that meant she intended to be awake, and Walter's hand found hers in the pre-dawn dark of the bedroom without either of them fully waking, and Maria lay there for a moment in the warm certainty of it all and thought, this is what I came west for. This, exactly. This and nothing less.